Dr. Douglas's research interests include applied macroeconomics, energy economics, public finance, and sports economics. He has published his research in outlets such as the Journal of Applied Econometrics, the Journal of International Financial Markets, Institutions, and Money, Energy Economics, the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, the Journal of Economics, and Economic Letters. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Douglas.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invite. It's great to be here. It's my first time actually in Hillsdale, Michigan, even though I was telling Tyler before the talk. My dad grew up in Concord, so I've been close, just never here, so it's nice to be here. So just a quick overview of my talk. In the short to medium run, I believe fossil fuels will dominate energy production and consumption. I just don't see any new energy sources that are ready for prime time yet. I think new extraction techniques of fossil fuels will help keep supply up and hold prices down. Although, as we'll see later on in the talk, I think this will be a struggle. It's going to be a long-term struggle to keep energy prices down, even though prices are down right now compared to the last 5 to 10 years or so. Given that there are no new energy sources that are ready for prime time, that are scalable at any reasonable cost, politicians just want to subsidize something with green energy. So if you have to subsidize something, my belief is that the subsidy should take the form of research and development of new sources, not the production or consumption of existing so-called green energy sources. These are a huge waste of money, in my view, and then you end up with black eyes like Solyndra, which you guys are all familiar with, right? The Solyndra debacle. What was that, like 2009, 2010? In my telling of time, that's like last year. So I guess it's kind of been a while now. And in terms of subsidies, I question whether these subsidies are necessary. There's a huge profit opportunity for whomever can invent the so-called next big thing in terms of energy. In order to justify any sort of subsidy, so let me put my public finance teaching hat on right now, to justify a subsidy, you would have to argue that there isn't an opportunity for the inventor of the new energy source to capture the profits from it, which would then preclude the inventor from inventing it in the first place. And it's just kind of weird for me to think that if you invent a new energy source, you're not able to profit from it. That would kind of be counter to what we've seen in the energy sector up until this point. Incidentally, as you guys probably know, since you're at Hillsdale, fossil fuels get a pretty bad rap. But I think we should take a step back and acknowledge the huge benefits from fossil fuels that clearly, in my view, outweigh the cost. And if you do a cost-benefit calculation for fossil fuel usage, my view isn't even close. Modern civilization just would not be possible without fossil fuels. There's a book that's been on my bookshelf for like 6 months now called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Has anyone read that book? I forget who wrote it. It got some really good press on the internet. I bought it and then I've been too busy to read it. So hopefully when my schedule settles down I can tackle that book. But just given the title of the book and the reviews on the internet, it sounds like it's right up my alley. To kind of give an overview about why fossil fuels are so beneficial, this is an article I pulled off the New York Times of all places. I didn't bring copies because I didn't know how many people would be here. But if you just Google when horses pose a public health hazard, it should pop up on Google. The article points out that people in New York City complain about dog waste. You can complain about fossil fuel pollution too in a similar vein. But dog waste, fossil fuel pollution is nothing compared to the pollution from horses. Back in the turn of the 19th century and the 20th century, 100 to 200,000 horses lived in New York City. That's a lot of horses. 200,000 horses lived in New York City. A typical horse produced anywhere from 15 to 30 pounds of manure with an average output of about 22 pounds per day and about a quart of urine per day, usually distributed along the course of its route or deposited in the stable. In 1818, in an attempt to control this nuisance, the New York City Council required that those who gathered and hauled manure, so-called dirt carting people, that's a pretty gross job to be a dirt carter. Mike Rowe did a dirty job in Mackinac Island, so you'll just watch that episode and multiply it by 10 because it's in the 1800s. Those people were required to be licensed. There's an 1880 New York Times article on the challenges facing the sanitation department. It singles out a manure pile on East 92nd Street, which was supposed to be cleared a grand total of once per year by May 1st, but had been left in place. And just imagine that, this pile had been left there for over a year. The manure piles attracted a large number of flies, and one journalist writing in the Appleton magazine in 1908 charged that about 20,000 New Yorkers died per year from diseases related to horse manure, the flies it attracted, and so forth. Horses pose another sanitation problem when they drop dead, sometimes from overwork, sometimes from disease, like the horse distemper outbreak that occurred. In 1880, New York City removed 15,000 dead horses from its streets. Sometimes a big carcass would be left simply to rot until it had disintegrated enough for someone to pick up the pieces. So just kind of think about that world, how dirty that would be when a horse dies in New York City. You just have to leave it there until it biodegrades enough for you to pick up the pieces and haul it away. So when people think about how dirty fossil fuels are, they're nowhere near as dirty as horse transportation just 100 or 200 years ago. Also, cars are a lot safer thanks to fossil fuels. If you look at the odds of being killed by a horse in New York City in 1900, those odds were 1 in 19,000. The odds of being killed in a car accident in 2011 in New York City, 1 in 26,000. Anyone in here read the news website salon.com? One person does, it's real, 2 people do, you guys see you laughing. It's like the Onion, right, for left-wingers, but they take it seriously. So I just read it because it's like the Onion to me. One of the writers sent out a tweet. I'm not really on Twitter. I have a profile. You can follow me. I've been like 2 years since I've tweeted. I've just kind of never got into it. Mostly because I don't have followers, which is really disheartening to me. So if I don't have followers, I don't tweet. And if I don't tweet, I don't have followers. I don't know how to solve that problem. I just need to be kind of like, Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, you just buy Twitter followers. But there was a tweet by a salon writer that said, cars should be banned because 2.5 million people go to hospitals per year due to car accidents. Claims like this, you should ban cars because of car accident injuries, given the historical evidence, just isn't credible, not a credible claim. So if we think about what affects oil prices in the short run, what affects oil prices are world events affecting the supply of oil. To put on my macroeconomics hat, that's called a supply shock. And then the world economy that affects the demand for oil. So we can talk about short-run fluctuations in oil prices and then more long-run trends in oil prices. So the long-run trends affecting oil prices, technological progress on extraction. We've made not we, like I had anything to do with it. Other people have made big technological improvements extracting oil from previously impossible to get sources, like in North Dakota and so forth. So that pushes prices downward in the long run, but there are declines in field production that pushes prices upward in the long run. Where you have an oil field, there's only so much oil in that field. When that oil becomes depleted, that's a decrease in supply, which puts upward pressure on price. So these are oil prices over time, adjusted for inflation. Do I know what the base year is? Yes, September 2000, about $15. So these prices are in constant September of 2015 dollars. And what you can see is, world oil prices are pretty flat until the mid-1970s. Does anyone know what happens here in the 1970s? Yeah.
OPEC cutting off the supply.
Right, as a response to the U.S. support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. So, right, Israel was attacked multiple times by its friendly Arab neighbors. Israel wins because they're supplied with U.S. arms. The Arabs lose because they're supplied with Soviet arms. And you can be outnumbered with better guns and still win. That's a good life lesson in general. So OPEC retaliates by restricting oil supply to the U.S. Basically, prices about triple overnight. Then they plateau on this higher level, 1979, they spike up again. What happens in 1979?
Iranian
The
Revolution.
Iranian Revolution, right? The Shah of Iran is overthrown, the Ayatollah Khomeini takes over, he's anti-American, oil prices rise, and the new Iranian regime, as we'll see a few slides later in the talk, are basically incompetent in terms of managing the Iranian oil industry. Also, I would recommend the movie Argo. Ben Affleck, not a fan, but overlook the fact Ben Affleck's in that movie and watch Argo anyway. Oil prices start to come down, and then they crash in 1986. Anyone know what happens in 1986 that causes oil prices to crash? This is what OPEC breaks down as a cartel. Because you know, perhaps from microeconomics, from game theory, that whenever you have a cartel, it's hard to enforce the cartel outcome because cartel members have incentive to cheat on each other. So in the early 80s, you have cartel members cheating. Saudi Arabia tries to offset that cheating by ratcheting down their production. But by 1986, they've ratcheted their production down so much that they've lost a ton of market share. And by 1986, the Saudis are like, well, what the hell, if everyone's cheating, we're going to cheat too. Let's ramp up production to try to get our market share back. Well, that causes oil prices to crash. They stayed pretty low until 1991. What happens there? Right, Saddam Hussein, Gulf War #1. Oil prices double when he invades Kuwait and then torches the oil wells on the way out. Fortunately, the Iraqi situation is resolved. We never have to worry about Iraq again. And then oil prices are fairly stable in the 90s. They crashed a little bit in the late 1990s due to the Southeast Asia financial crisis and the Russian financial crisis, which reduces oil demand. And then 2001, oil prices trend upward. As we'll see in a few slides, this is really due to increasing demand by China and India and the emerging economies. Oil prices spike at the run up to the financial crisis, crash in 2008, start trending back upward as the world economy slowly recovers, and then we can see we can have a mini crash here from 2013. And when I checked oil prices, which was last Friday in my hotel room in Kansas City, this is what they are. I saw on CNBC as a headline, oil was up a little bit since the Federal Reserve said that they're going to hold interest rates constant, and I couldn't be bothered to change my slide. So whatever they are today, they're probably still less than $50 a barrel. So you can kind of see, just given my quick and dirty history of oil prices since the mid-1970s, the supply shocks here, supply shock in the good direction, supply shock, demand shock, goofy stuff with the financial crisis, and then supply. So you can explain oil prices, short-run fluctuations in oil prices through supply and demand, like I said a couple slides ago. So this is a slide of non-OECD liquid fuels consumption and their GDP growth. As you saw from the previous slide, up until recent times, oil prices had been rising since 2001 or so. And like I said in that slide, the increase in oil prices following 2001 was due to rising consumption by China and India. So OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So OECD are the developed countries. So non-OECD are the developing or emerging economies. As you can see from this graph, this kind of, I don't know what color this is, like beige maybe. I need to consult the Lands End catalog. This would be like sand or something. But consumption of liquid fuels by these non-OECD countries, China and India, has been rising by about 4% per year until kind of mid-2014, and then this was the forecast for 2015. So the problem is, their consumption was rising by 4% a year, but world oil production was only rising by 1.15% during that time. So consumption or demand was rising more rapidly than supply, which, as you know from introductory economics, that pushes up prices upward. Hence that rising trend from 2001. What's interesting is, what about the developing countries? What about these advanced economies who are, questions?
Just for a second, can we go back to that last slide, please, for a minute?
Sure.
Okay, is the green line or greenish line, is that GDP? And the blue, the fuel consumption?
Oh yeah, I had it backwards, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll make an excuse for my mistake. Looking at the side, I saw this lined up with that, you're right. So it's, the GDP is about 2 to 3%, which is, I'm sorry, the oil consumption is about 2 to 3%, which is still higher than the 1.15% in growth in supply. So the price story still is the same, even though I can't read a legend. So what I think is interesting is when you look at the advanced economies, these OECD countries, the trend was from the 80s till about 2007, a slight increase in consumption of oil. But from 2007 to 2012, oil consumption for these advanced economies actually declined. So when you see world oil consumption rising during this time, the rise in consumption isn't from advanced economies like the US or Western Europe. It's from developing countries like China and India. So this is world oil production over time. The percentage change in world oil production over time, data I took from the Energy Information Agency, Administration, I'm sorry, which is a good source for energy-related data. What you can see from this graph is there's some fluctuation in the percentage change in world oil production, but on average, it's remained, relatively constant since the 80s. So what that illustrates is, again, what's pushing up prices from 2001 until a couple of years ago was rising consumption by China and India. On the flip side, what that means is, if the Chinese or Indian economies slow down, that's going to result in a big decrease in demand for oil. Given the trend for the more developed economies, if China and India demand slowed down, that would mean that world oil prices would then subsequently fall. So if we think about, well, what's caused world oil prices to fall more recently? Well, the slowdown in the Chinese economy is playing a pretty big role. So the next slide, a lot of people have become optimistic about these new sources of oil in the U.S., especially in North Dakota, because what's kind of interesting is between 2005 and 2012, world oil production rose by about 2 million barrels per day. Or 2 million barrels per day. So there was a rise in world oil production between 2005 and 2012. An extra 2 million barrels per day, which is a pretty decent bump. All of this increase came from these non-traditional sources of oil, places like North Dakota. These are the different, what do you call them, shale formations or whatever. Lots of people are familiar with the Bakken formation. Eagle Ford is another pretty famous one. So you can see 2005 to 2012, a big run-up in production from these non-traditional sources of oil. The problem is that when you forecast the production from these sources, they plateau kind of mid-next decade, and then start to decline in 2030 to kind of plateau out at a smaller level. So we're kind of in a nice sweet spot right now. All this new supply coming online, pushing prices down. The Chinese economy slowing down, which is pushing world prices down. The question is how long does that sweet spot last? If the Chinese economy picks up steam next decade, that'll increase world demand. Like this graph points out, next decade, production from these new fields kind of tends to flatten out and then decline a little bit. What that suggests is that world oil prices will start to rise again. So this is kind of more recent history of world oil prices from 2009 to 2015. This just kind of shows the substantial decline in the price of oil that's happened recently. Just a couple of years ago, we're at about $100 per barrel. 2014 to 2015, the price falls from $100 a barrel or so to about $50 a barrel or so. So if you think about the reasons for this decline, I've kind of already covered them. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but again, it's decreasing demand from China. The Western European economy is a pretty big disaster, right? The Eurozone, their Greek crisis and so forth is slowing down demand from Western Europe. The US economic recovery remains disappointing, so the demand for oil from the US is lower than maybe anticipated. Also, what's interesting is Saudi Arabia is kind of doing a repeat of 1986. In 1986, right, they decided they had lost enough market share from OPEC cheating that they were going to ramp up production to protect their share of the market. Well, instead of OPEC cheating now, the problem is you have all these non-OPEC sources of production, right? The oil drillers in North Dakota are not OPEC members. Russia is not an OPEC member, I don't believe, at least. So Saudi Arabia feels threatened by these new sources of oil, so they're being very aggressive at producing oil at this lower price, even though that might be a loss for them, in order to protect their place in the world oil market. So my prediction for world oil prices is, even though prices are low right now, I expect there to be volatility in the short to medium run for a couple reasons. One, world oil supplies and refining capacity are tight, at least in the US. Any sort of refinery disruption causes prices to respond very aggressively. Back in April or May, I think, I'm not very good with time apparently, there was a refinery disruption at a BP refinery down in Indiana, Illinois, somewhere around there. That caused a pretty big price response in Michigan. Michigan gas prices went up way above the national average as a result. So any sort of little hiccup due to the lack of excess capacity in refining gets reflected in price rather than quantity. Also, like I pointed out, world oil demand is increasing due to the demand from developing nations, at least up until recently. As everyone knows, the good Lord blessed us to put oil in the least stable part of the world, although it's not clear how causation works. I guess you could probably put oil anywhere and instability would result. Given that that's true, any sort of political disruption causes big swings in oil prices. To be kind of, to put on my economics hat, we could say both the supply and the demand for oil are what's called price inelastic, meaning people on both sides of the market are not price sensitive to oil, which makes sense, right, intuitively speaking. If you see the price of gas go up by 5 cents a gallon, you buy basically the same quantity of gas as before. If the price of gas goes up by, say, a dime or a quarter per gallon, you kind of buy about the same amount of gas as before, because they're not real great substitutes for gas, right? Walking, riding your bike, taking a bus, carpooling, those are all terrible substitutes, right? Your birthright as a Michigander is to be able to drive in your car by yourself. At least that's how I prefer to drive. So it takes a big increase in gas prices to get people to respond by buying a smaller quantity. James Hamilton, who's probably the premier oil economist, energy economist of the US, a faculty member at UC San Diego, he estimates that the short-run elasticity of demand for oil is 0.068, which means a 10% increase in oil prices causes quantity demanded to fall by a very small percent. So again, people just don't respond much to oil prices unless the price swing is pretty big. So this is a bit of a dated example at this point, but it was like a year or two ago. Again, I'm bad with time. So Gaddafi is overthrown of Libya in 2010, 2011-ish. And then there's like the period of instability because what do you know, we meddled in a foreign country and things didn't really go that smoothly. Oil is a pretty big Libyan export. It's pretty small in terms of total world oil supply. It's about 700,000 barrels per day, which is about 0.85% of world oil production. So there is some concern with the instability of Libya that Libyan oil production would go offline. We would lose about 1% of world oil supply. At that time, world oil prices skyrocketed. You kind of think, well, why would you see this big price response for a fear of losing 1% of total world supply? Well, given this elasticity estimate, if you lose 1% of world oil supply, prices would have to rise by 12% for supply to equal demand and for the market to clear. So a 12% rise in oil prices, if oil's $100 a barrel, that's a pretty good rise. That's a $12 per barrel rise in price. The problem is, to compound this, is that if Libyan oil production went offline, that would result in widespread fear in the world oil market. Because if Libya falls, what other country, what's the next domino to fall? Which would cause prices to rise even further. So all it takes is like a little bit of fear of a supply disruption, throw in people being insensitive to price for oil, and you get a pretty big price response as a result. This is a pretty good rule of thumb if you want to be smart at a cocktail party and predict what the price of gas is going to be. You take 84 cents, this represents taxes and oil company profit per gallon of gas, and add that to 2.5% of the price of a barrel of Brent crude oil. So Brent crude oil, this is crude oil that's drilled off of the North Sea, close to Norway. For whatever reason, this formula predicts gas prices pretty good. It's about 50 cents in taxes, and then the rest, on average, is oil company markup for profits and expenses and so forth. So again, if you want to tie Libya into gas prices, suppose Libyan production goes offline. Like I said, with this elasticity of demand, prices would have to rise by 12%, assuming there's no other fear in the market, which is not a realistic assumption. If you apply this formula at $100 per barrel, gasoline would be $3.34 a gallon. Just applying this formula, $100 a barrel times 2.5% plus 84 cents, $3.34 per gallon. A 12% or a $12 rise in oil prices using this formula means gas prices would rise to $3.64 as a result, which is a 30-cent swing. That's a pretty decent swing. So again, you just have to, you see these potential small disruptions in the world oil market get reflected to big swings in gas prices. But with that said, yeah, there's a lot of volatility in perhaps prices for oil. But what helps offset that volatility is that the U.S. is becoming more energy efficient over time. This is some data from the Energy Information Administration. It's petroleum and natural gas consumption per real dollar of GDP. So if you want to produce a dollar of GDP, how much oil and gas is it going to take to produce a dollar of GDP? So this is thousands of BTUs, British thermal units. And as you can see, this kind of peaks in the 1970s, takes a big hit in the 1980s, and then is still trending downward. Which means that over time, it's taking less and less energy in the US to generate a dollar of GDP. Which means the US economy is more resilient right now to rapid swings in oil prices compared to the 1970s, say. Because if you go back to that OPEC deal in the 1970s, the Yom Kippur War, OPEC, oil prices triple, that leads to a really, really nasty recession, especially in Michigan. The nationwide unemployment rate peaks at something like 10%, I think. In Michigan, the unemployment rate peaks at something closer to like 15 to 20%. I forget the exact number. I can only think in fives and zeros, so somewhere between 15 and 20%. Massive recession. in the 1970s. You have a big run-up in oil prices in 2007. Do you see a similar nasty recession? Well, yeah, you did, but probably wasn't due to oil prices. It probably had more to do with the housing market and so forth. So just this increasing efficiency of the US economy in terms of energy usage is kind of a nice buffer to wild swings in oil prices, which probably helped the 2008 recession, which was bad, not be that much worse. Because the worst that you could have had happen was housing market crash in 2008, coupled with 1970s style response to the massive run-up in oil prices we saw at that time. This is a graph I think is kind of interesting. This is a graph of what's called the break-even price of oil. Because oil-producing countries are not really known as like these efficient, Western-style democracies that don't waste that much money, right? That's not the image you have in your head about, say, Saudi Arabia or Venezuela. These countries took big bets about oil remaining expensive forever. And as a result, these countries require a high price of oil to balance their budgets. Russia, it needs about $100 per barrel to break even. That's what we mean by the break-even price of oil. What does the price of oil have to be so the government breaks even and doesn't run a budget deficit? So Russia needs $100 a barrel, Nigeria needs $126 per barrel, Saudi Arabia needs about $99 per barrel. This is from 2014. I tried to find new data and I couldn't. I don't think it's substantially different. Kuwait is not so bad, $54 a barrel is what they need. OPEC nations in general need $110 per barrel. And as you can see, I forgot to update this graph because things have gotten a little bit worse for them. We're right about here now. So the question is how long can these countries hold on before things really melt down? Venezuela, right, they need $162 a barrel to break even. How's the Venezuela? Yeah.
Is that simply to break even? Does that mean for oil production, or does that mean for break even on the production, or does that mean for the government budgets?
For the government budgets. How much? What does the price of oil have to be so the government brings in enough revenue to break even? Yeah.
Is that because all of those countries, their oil interests are owned by the states, or is it through like tax revenue?
I think both. A lot of these have state-owned oil companies. A lot of it's tax revenue. Yeah, I think both. I don't know how it breaks down country to country.
So just to be sure, that means you don't have if they get up that high, they don't have a deficit in their budget, in the annual budget.
Yes, I believe that's correct. Oil was this high for a while, so lots of these countries built up foreign exchange reserves. They ran a surplus and built up foreign exchange reserves. But with oil being low, that's starting to drain down the foreign exchange reserves from these countries. For instance, if you look at, where do I have it written down here? Like Russia had about $500 billion of foreign exchange reserves in 2013. In 2014, that had fallen to about $350 billion, just because the price of oil is much less than their break-even price. Saudi Arabia last year posted about a $40 billion budget deficit, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the Saudi economy is much smaller than ours. So Saudi Arabia ran a budget deficit equivalent of 5% of GDP. Which is a pretty substantial budget deficit. Our budget deficit right now, I believe, is about 2.5% of GDP, which is about $450 billion. So just double that for the Saudi equivalent of their budget deficit. So they're running a budget deficit for what for us would be about $1 trillion. So for instance, Russia, we talked about their foreign exchange reserves being whittled down to the low price of oil. Their budget deficit was something like 10% of GDP last year. Their economy was expected to contract by 3% this year. I don't know if it has or not. Something like 40% of all Venezuelan government revenues came from the oil industry. So Venezuela requires 40% of their government revenues to come from the oil industry, and they're banking on $162 a barrel to break even. You can kind of do the math about what sub $50 per barrel oil is going to do to their economy. It also doesn't help that when he was in power, Hugo Chavez ramped up government spending from something like 30% of Venezuelan GDP to 45% of Venezuelan GDP. If you look at Iranian oil production, I stole this graph from somewhere because the Energy Information Administration website isn't that good. I had trouble getting this graph from them, but I know this graph is right. You can see during the Shah's reign, oil production steadily rose. Here's where the Shah's overthrown. Oil production tanks. It's trended upward, but what's interesting is that with Iran, right now, they're producing less oil than they did before the revolution. So this helps explain why the Iranian economy right now is just a total mess. Oil prices are down, or oil revenue is down something like 30% in Iran due to falling oil prices. You have double-digit inflation in Iran, double-digit unemployment. So if you kind of look at this graph, and you look at the Iranian economy, I just have a hard time believing that Iran constitutes any sort of serious threat to the U.S. I mean, they're just too big of a basket case, in my view, to be a threat. Because if you look at the size of Iran, Iran's economy is kind of about the same size as Connecticut's. So just picture Connecticut, that's very heavily oil dependent, with a mismanaged oil sector, with double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment. Would you really think that Connecticut was a threat at that point? I don't think so. I tend to think that if you wanted to, you could just squash Connecticut like a bug at that point. So, you know, just as a political side note, all these deals with Iran, all this fear, my view is just leave them alone, and eventually they'll just implode due to those fundamentals. Venezuelan oil production. The oil industry in Venezuela was completely mismanaged by Chavez, much like the rest of the Venezuelan economy. It's extra bad for Venezuela because Venezuelan crude oil is heavy and hard to refine. People call it heavy sour crude because it has a high sulfur content. So it's very energy intensive to refine. It's less profitable than, say, light sweet crude that you can kind of pull out of the ground, not spend much energy refining. There's an interesting article in Bloomberg, Bloomberg Business, by Megan McArdle. Does anyone here read Megan McArdle? Anyone here? Megan McArdle? I'd recommend reading Megan McArdle. She's a good columnist. She used to write for The Economist. She wrote for, where was she before Bloomberg? The Atlantic. She was at The Atlantic before Bloomberg. After Chavez's death, she wrote an article that's pretty damning about Chavez's mismanagement of the Venezuelan economy. Given that Venezuelan crude oil is heavy and sour, you need a lot of foreign expertise to refine it. The problem is that after Chavez took power, he kicked out all the foreign petroleum engineers out of the country after a failed 2002 coup that he blamed on the U.S. So under Chavez's logic, there was a coup, it must have been by the U.S., which means that the American petroleum engineer, he's responsible, we better throw him out of the country. Well, the problem is you like throw out all of your experts, who's going to refine that crude oil? Well, the answer is, turns out nobody. So oil production in Venezuela, trended downward after the 2002 coup. If you look at the economic management of Chavez, besides that, the best you could say about Venezuela during the Chavez years was that they were about average compared to the rest of South America. And you say, oh yeah, average isn't that bad. Well, wait a second. Venezuela has a lot of oil. Not a lot of other South American countries do. If you have a lot of oil, you should do better than average. That's like taking a 7-foot-tall basketball player and playing against me. And we win about the same games in terms of one-on-one. That doesn't look so good for the 7-foot-tall basketball player. You should be winning more games. So back in the 2000s, Chavez was kind of like this folk hero to the American left. because he was going to create this, social justice state of Venezuela with lots of social spending and so forth. So it's funny how the American left has stopped giving that narrative in 2015. But just in case you run across someone who does, maybe print out that article by Megan McArdle and wave it in his or her face. This is a messy looking graph, but it's a useful graph. It's gasoline prices, both in nominal terms, not adjusted for inflation, and adjusted for inflation. What's interesting is that since the 1930s, gas prices adjusted for inflation have trended down until that run-up in 2001. So the average price in 2012 was $3.56. Extend this graph out, I paid $2.30 today on my way in, so we're right about here. Which means, adjusted for inflation, we're paying about the same for gas as we did in the early 1970s. Which is interesting, because we've burned a lot of gasoline supplies between 1970 and now, which just shows the importance of technological improvement in oil extraction and keeping prices down. If you take it a step further, gasoline mileage has improved a lot since the 1970s. On average, gasoline mileage has about doubled since the 1960s, 1970s, which means you could go twice as far on the same tank of gas compared to back then. Which means if you figure out costs per mile in driving now compared to back then, it's actually cheaper to drive now compared to back then. And that's what this next graph shows. Natural gas prices. Natural gas prices rose pretty substantially during the 2000s, and then they peaked and stopped rising and started trending downward. This is due to fracking, of course. People like to criticize fracking. It's kind of the next trendy thing to be outraged about. But fracking has some benefits. Prices are low. Prices are lower, of course. And a benefit is natural gas is much cleaner than alternate sources of energy, such as coal or oil. So people back in the 1990s, I was alive in the 1990s, a couple people in the room were, lots of people weren't. In my view, the 1990s were 5 years ago. So it's hard to believe the 90s are 20 years ago at this point. But back in the 1990s, people criticized the US for not ratifying the Kyoto, I think, the Kyoto Treaty, which called for the US to reduce emissions below their 1990 level. It was this worldwide treaty to reduce CO2 emissions. The US, I believe, the Clinton administration tried to sign it, but the Senate wouldn't ratify it, and people criticized the US for being so backward. We wouldn't ratify Kyoto. But when you look at emissions right now in the US are below their 1995 level. Simply because of fracking. Fracking has pushed natural gas prices down, which causes people to switch to natural gas, which is cleaner, and away from coal, which is dirtier in terms of CO2 consumption. Also, the Energy Information Administration estimates that there's about 2.2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves remaining, which is estimated to last 100 years, assuming no new sources of natural gas are found. So yeah, it's cool to criticize fracking, but fracking has a nice effect on price. Fracking has a nice effect of switching away from dirtier energy to so-called cleaner energy, if you think that's a concern. And if you look at the scientific evidence, I think there's a pretty convincing case to be made that fracking, if done properly, is safe. And this is a graph from the Federal Reserve. As you can see, rising natural gas prices in terms of household expenditures on utility were a big problem over the last, say, 20 years or so, until about 2010 when prices started falling, which means households had to spend less on utilities, which leaves them more money to spend on other things. So to talk a little bit about clean energy compared to traditional sources of energy, this is again from the Energy Information Administration. This is the cost of generating 1 megawatt hour for various electricity sources. So a megawatt hour is defined as a million watts of power used continuously for an hour. So if you want to generate a megawatt hour for coal, you're looking at about $95. For natural gas, about $66. So here you can see that price effect, natural gas versus coal, why people are switching away from coal towards natural gas, and why carbon emissions are falling in the US, like I said. Nuclear is going to cost you about the same as coal. Geothermal is pretty cheap, but you got to be careful, right? You've got to be in the right spot for geothermal. If you're in Iceland, that's great. If you're in Michigan, not so much. So this kind of represents the low end in terms of cost of generating from these sources. Wind, you're looking at about $80 megawatt hour. I'll get to wind in a second. Offshore wind, you're looking at $200 per megawatt hour. Solar PV, this is photovoltaic. Photovoltaic solar, what this means is the sun hits the solar panel and then like a reaction happens which generates electricity. Solar thermal just means the sun hits the solar panel and the heat generates the electricity. That's more expensive, at least now. And hydroelectric is fairly cheap, but again, you've got to be in the right location. So if you're next to a dammable river, hydroelectric is pretty cheap, but if you're in the middle of the desert, again, doesn't really apply. So the orange bars, what I did was, I wanted to include the cost of carbon dioxide. Because that's the criticism that the global warming guys make. They say, you know, when you generate power using coal, the cost of generating power doesn't include the cost of carbon dioxide. And if you believe in global warming, that's a real cost. It's a cost that isn't paid by the power plant, it's paid by everyone else. It's your classic negative externality case. So I wanted to say, well, let's try to add back in the cost of carbon. An estimate is $40 a ton. So that's what I use. So if you add in a cost of $40 per ton of carbon dioxide, that means it costs $135.60 to generate a megawatt hour of coal, $86.30 to generate a megawatt hour of natural gas. Nuclear doesn't change because nuclear doesn't emit carbon dioxide, and these don't change either. So even if you account for the cost of carbon dioxide, these energy sources just aren't cost effective. Unless you happen to live near a river you can dam up, or you live in Iceland. Nuclear actually starts looking pretty good compared to coal, if you include the cost of carbon dioxide. So if you think about wind and solar, the problem is with these two energy sources is you rely on the weather to generate electricity. Which if you live in Michigan, you know why that's problematic, right? So if you look at capacity utilization by source, you know, coal, natural gas, nuclear, geothermal, you can run those at 90% or so capacity basically forever. Just because you could always feed in coal to the coal power plant, you could always pipe in natural gas in the natural gas plant, you could always, you know, have nuclear reactions, and if you're in Iceland, you know, the lava underneath the earth isn't going anywhere. But for wind, it's not always windy, right? So on average, a windmill only works 35% of the time. And it's not a steady 35% of the time, right? If it was, we could solve the problem. You just build extra windmills to get it back up to 100% of what you need. It's a 35% average with lots of volatility. Sometimes 100%, sometimes 0%, depending on the wind. And the problem is that, right, there's no way to store electricity. We don't have the battery technology to generate a bunch of electricity when it's windy like today, store it in the energy warehouse, and then draw it down on the calm day. So what that means is when you have windmills, you have to backstop those windmills with the traditional sources of energy just so you can use the lights on calm days. Same with offshore winds, you know, same with solar panels. Because, you know, sometimes it's not sunny like today, and you want to use electricity when it's sunny, or when it's not sunny, I mean. So other issues with wind, from my perspective at least, first, windmills are ugly. They're ugly to look at. I think they ruin the landscape. They kill a lot of flying creatures. Windmills kill a lot of birds and bats, which to me is kind of funny that the environmentalists don't complain about that more. Popular Mechanics, for instance, reports that windmills kill close to 1 million bats per year. That's a lot of bats. And then you need a lot of windmills to displace a coal power plant, but like I said previous slide, you never really displace a coal power plant because you still need the coal power plant to generate electricity when it's not windy. So for instance, just to kind of think about how many windmills you need to displace a coal power plant, a large windmill might generate 5 megawatts of power when it's being used. A large coal power plant might generate 2,000 megawatts of power. So you can do the math, right? Even if the windmills ran 100% of the time, which we know they won't, because it's not windy 100% of the time, but let's suppose it is. What that means is, at 5 megawatts per windmill, you would need 400 windmills to replace one 2,000 megawatt coal power plant. Well, where are you going to put 400 windmills? How much area is that going to take? How expensive is it going to be to throw up 400 windmills? What are the maintenance costs on them? To me, there's just no way they could ever pass a cost-benefit calculation, even if you account for the cost of carbon dioxide. So the Cape Wind Project, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Cape Wind Project. They're trying to build this offshore wind farm off of Cape Cod. And what to me is kind of nice about it is, this is where all the liberals live, so you can kind of laugh at them, get upset about, the problems associated with windmills while they push wind energy on everyone else. But the Cape Cod Wind Project just doesn't even come close to passing a cost-benefit analysis. So first of all, the Cape Cod people, in my view, are right in the sense that it will kind of ruin the view. Because this is what Cape Cod is supposed to look like after this offshore wind farm is built. To me, that just looks hideous. Here you are enjoying the Atlantic Ocean, and the windmills dot the horizon. And this is a picture from capewind.org, which is the company trying to build the Cape Wind Project. This picture is on their website to reassure people that, oh, the view won't be ruined. I look at that like, what are you talking about? The view is totally ruined, at least to me. This is a picture of Oscoda, Michigan, my hometown. We're on Lake Huron. I went for a run last fall. I took this picture. To me, it's kind of a nice picture. And I thought to myself, what if we dotted the horizon with a bunch of windmills? Wouldn't that just look terrible? I think to me, at least, the answer is yes. So who wants to look at a bunch of windmills offshore? More seriously, why is the Cape Wind Project problematic? Well, first, the total cost is $2.6 billion. That's a lot of money. There's a few $100 million in tax credits and loan guarantees. It's hard to know how much in terms of tax credits and loan guarantees because these things are secret. One estimate set up to 30% of capital costs. The problem is that when you look at the electricity generated by the Cape Wind Project, an equivalent natural gas plant, which is pretty clean, as we saw from a few slides ago, would only cost $400 to $10 million. What is that? It's like eighth of the cost, roughly. The Cape Wind Project is estimated to run at about 30% capacity on average, which means that an equivalent natural gas plant would cost $158 million. So is that like 5% of the cost? A fairly clean burning natural gas plant? At this capacity factor, the Cape Wind Project is only displacing 1/10 of a large coal burning power plant. So you kind of think about the Cape Wind Project, what's the point? You're not saving anything. You're spending a bunch of money to displace basically no coal power. You could do the same thing with natural gas at a fraction of the price. So what's Cape Wind all about? To me, it's all about signaling. I think in economics, the more I think about economics, the longer I teach economics, the more I come to realize that lots of things people do is about signaling. To signal your intentions about something, to signal how much you care about something, which is why you send roses to your girlfriend on Valentine's Day, or you want to signal how much you love her. That's why you wear like the AIDS ribbon, right? You know, Rush Limbaugh in the 90s had this funny skit where he had like a bunch of ribbons on his suit coat. And he said, you know, I'm wearing all these ribbons, that shows how much more I care than you do. That's why in the NFL, everyone wears pink, you know, pink cleats, you know, pink shorts, you know, pink jock strap, you know, pink mouth guard, just to show how much you care about breast cancer. You know, the fact that, you know, none of that money finds its way to breast cancer research, we don't care, because we just want to show people how much we care. And I think that's what's going on here. You're not really doing anything, but you build all these windmills that everyone on Cape Cod can see. Well, look, that just shows how much we care about green energy. I think I got 4 more. How are we doing on time? You want me to shut up? You want me to keep going to finish up?
If you wrap up in the next couple minutes.
Couple minutes? Okay. The electric car, not a fan of that either. The problem is with the electric cars don't reduce emissions, they just displace emissions from the tailpipe to the power plant. The mining of the lithium for the battery is a pretty dirty process. Incidentally, this first bullet point, my cousin has a 5th grader, she figured this out. And I saw her in May, she worked as an economics professor, and she started talking about the electric car. She's like, you know, you don't save any emissions, all you do is displace the coal power plant. I'm like, yeah, you do know that. It's kind of interesting you know that. And the politician doesn't know that. Probably does, it just doesn't care. Mining of lithium is a pretty dirty process. There's an interesting op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Boren Lundberg, the skeptical environmentalist. He says that when an electric car rolls off the assembly line, it has the equivalent of 80,000 miles of emissions under its belt already. More than double a conventional car, just because mining lithium is so dirty. You would need to drive an electric car 90,000 miles in order to emit 24% fewer emissions than a conventional car. So when these celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio buy an electric car just to sit on it and not drive it, they're actually making the problem a lot worse. And it's compounded by the fact that everyone with a cell phone knows this, that battery life gets shorter and shorter the more and more you use the battery. So for example, the Nissan Leaf, the range declines from 75 miles to 55 miles in about 5 years. And also, companies like Tesla are very heavily subsidized by the government. They got $1.3 billion in subsidies to build a plant in Nevada. They get property tax abatements, and they don't actually make money selling cars. They make money by selling emission tax credits, because California has a draconian emissions law that cars that are sold have to meet an emissions standard. Well, no car can meet that standard, except electric cars, because we just count emissions from the tailpipe, not the factory. So those emissions can be traded, which means if Tesla sells an electric car, they can sell those emission rates to a guy in California and make a profit off of that, which is the only way Tesla makes money. So I guess I'll just kind of end here, and I'll just do a quick Leonardo DiCaprio rant, because he's my least favorite actor. So when you see guys drive, like Leonardo DiCaprio drive an electric car, just know that he's making the problem worse. And if you had a list for me of the worst person in the world, he'd be at the top of the list. Because he's the biggest environmentalist out there, right? He goes to the United Nations and talks about carbon emissions, talks about global warming. But then when you look at what he does, when the World Cup was in Brazil, he partied in a yacht docked off of the coast of Brazil, and the yacht was owned by the Prince of Abu Dhabi. Just running the air condition and the electrical system on that yacht would burn 250 gallons of diesel fuel per hour. The typical American buys 1,200 gallons of gas a year. So 5 hours of Leonardo DiCaprio partying burns the equivalent fuel of an American driving a car for a year. So who's the real problem? When you sail that yacht across the ocean, because it didn't just teleport from Abu Dhabi to Brazil, right? You had to take it across the ocean. Sailing the yacht across the ocean could burn 1,000 gallons of diesel fuel per hour. Which means when Leonardo DiCaprio sailed that yacht over to party, Every hour it sailed burned the equivalent of 1 American's driving per year. To me, it takes a lot of cojones to go to the UN and talk about global warming when you're like the world's biggest offender. So with that rant, I'll conclude.
We do have time for a couple questions if no one has any. So we'll call them. Well, if nobody has any questions, and then I guess we conclude. So thank you once again.
All right, thank you.